Nationwide protests push Sudan's prime minister to resign. With the military in full control of the country once again, can Sudan find a way back toward civilian rule, or is it back to square one? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's Newsmaker is Sudan's political crisis. Just days after more nationwide pro-democracy rallies turned deadly, Sudan's Prime Minister, Abdalla Hamdok, has resigned, deepening the country's political turmoil. Now, Hamdok signed a deal with the military on November 21st to restore the country's transition period and return to the constitutional declaration, which was largely suspended by the coup. But he admitted a failure to establish the basis for civilian rule and democracy. So, just 6 weeks after being reinstated as part of the agreement, Hamdok left the military in full control of Sudan.
I have tried my best to stop the country from sliding towards disaster. Sudan is crossing now a dangerous turning point that threatens its whole survival. In view of the fragmentation of the political forces and conflicts between the components of the transition, despite everything, I tried to reach a consensus, to fulfill our promises to the people, security, peace, and avoid bloodshed. But all this has not happened.
Now, on Sunday, security forces fired tear gas at anti-military protesters in Sudan's capital, Khartoum, as thousands marched toward the presidential palace. It was the latest round of protests that have seen almost 60 people killed since the coup. Internet and mobile services were disrupted and all bridges to Khartoum were closed. But people remained defiant. They reiterated their key demand that the military play no role in government during a transition to free elections. Meanwhile, coup leader General Abdul al-Burhan says no one who causes violence will go unpunished. Let's look back now at how the crisis has unfolded. Months of protest preceded the ouster of then-President Omar al-Bashir, who, after 3 decades in power, was overthrown by the military in 2019. In August that year, a power-sharing deal was signed between the army and civilian groups, aimed at paving the way for a transitional government and elections. As part of the agreement, Abdalla Hamdok was appointed prime minister to eventually head the Transitional Governing Council. But in October 2021, General Abdul al-Burhan staged a military coup, dissolving the council and ending the power-sharing deal. The army detained several high-ranking officials and placed Hamdok under house arrest. Now, following protests, Hamdok was reinstated as prime minister in November in a deal that called for a government of technocrats under military oversight. Again outraged, pro-democracy activists took to the streets in protest. So does this resignation bring Sudan closer to or further from that democratic transition? Well, here to discuss that now from Khartoum is Rabie Abdul, Atti Obeid. He's a former senior official in Sudan's National Congress Party and a Sudanese national political analyst. From Nairobi is Kholood Khair. She is the managing partner at Insight Strategy Partners, a think tank founded to support transition in Sudan. And from Washington, D.C. is Cameron Hudson, a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Africa Center and the former chief of staff to the U.S. Special Envoy to Sudan. Thanks all so much for being with us. Let's begin in Khartoum with Rabie Obeid. And I want to ask first what you made of the Prime Minister's resignation. And do you think he was sincere about the reasons he gave for resigning, or is something else behind it?
I think that this resignation of Abdalla Hamdok as Prime Minister after the agreement between the military of Sudan, the commander of the military of Sudan, Abdul al-Burhan, he said that he failed to have actually a census between all political parties and all the portfolios that all the formation of the governments 2 times. Also, he failed to actually find consensus between all these political parties, and he didn't find any programs from the forces and change power that already made an agreement between the military so that this transitional period will be a successful transitional period to reach the time of the election. That is why I think that due to the failure of two governments formed by the Prime Minister Abdalla Hamdok, he resigned. And I don't think that there is any reason behind his resignation except this reason.
Okay, let me ask Kholood. I mean, was it his failure, or did he have really no chance to succeed, given what the military, many see, what the military ultimately wants, which is to maintain power for itself?
Yes, I mean, we have to, say it as it is, call it as it is here. The coup of the 25th of October effectively ended the transition. And the agreement that was signed on the 21st of November that released the prime minister massively curtailed his executive space, his ability to make decisions. And that's the reason why he ended up resigning, because he couldn't get anything done. He couldn't undo some of the, or all of the appointments and decisions that were made shortly after the coup. And so he was left with very little by way of, making good on the promises that he had made. And once he had felt that he couldn't deliver, he resigned. I think it's very disingenuous to blame this on consensus within the political parties or within the prime minister himself, when really the biggest factor here is the fact that the military didn't allow him the space to be able to see through his priorities.
So if he couldn't do it, is there someone now that can?
Well, I think this goes beyond individuals. I think one of the things that Hamdok's tenure in government showed us is that we can't rely on individuals to lead through a very large, very involved transformational political process. Pro-democracy groups in Sudan understand this. They're not calling for a new prime minister to be installed. They're calling for full civilian rule and to undo the systems put in place during the Bashir era, systems we're very much returning to now after this coup, and really sort of bring about the real commitment to civilian-led rule that is needed, not this sort of faux partnership that we've had over the past 2 years.
Okay. Cameron, I think the fear now, in part, is that even though his resignation was expected by some, and many argue he couldn't really have done much anyway, that still his resignation actually further empowers the military at this point. Do you think that's true, or are there actual alternatives that can succeed this prime minister's post?
Well, let's be clear. I don't think that the military was feeling particularly constrained in their actions, even when Prime Minister Hamdok was in office. I think, if anything, his departure puts a lot more pressure on the military, because they have lost the fig leaf of credibility that he was bringing to the government. We could at least say that this was a civilian-led government, even if we didn't believe it. You saw members of the international community supporting the November 21st deal, even though it empowered the military further, because they were trying to give Prime Minister Hamdok specifically the room to try to make a go of that deal. That didn't happen. But of course, now that the military doesn't have an affable civilian prime minister in place, serving essentially as a heat shield for them, I think you're going to see a more perhaps emboldened international community looking at the military now as the sole governing authority in the country, and therefore taking complete responsibility for anything that comes next, and having to be accountable for the crimes that have been committed just in the past few weeks, the killing of more than 50 unarmed protesters to start, but certainly not ending there. So I do think that they face new pressure now that Prime Minister Hamdok has resigned.
Okay, but I mean, under that pressure, we still have General Burhan saying that nobody causing violence will go unpunished. I mean, what kind of warning is that? You've seen how many dozens of people die just trying to protest and demand democratic rights, and he's saying, if you go out in the street and cause violence, fear the consequences.
Well, I think, again, it is a return to kind of Bashir-era governance. I mean, this is an authoritarian regime, not just in in name only, in practice. And so they are returning to the strategies and tactics of governance that have, long been employed in Sudan. So I do think that we have to take those warnings seriously. I think we have to be very fearful of an escalation of the conflict, and seeing protesters take to the streets now and be met with an even more violent response, if that's possible. Let's remember that the bloodiest period of the entire revolution came in June of 2019, when the military and its allies cleared out a sit-in protest in front of army headquarters, killing potentially hundreds of people who we still don't have documented, and there's still been no accountability for those crimes. So I do think that the military has it in it to undertake an even more violent response.
Okay, let me go back to Khartoum. Rabie, Obeid, is this the return of Bashir's regime, essentially just without Omar al-Bashir?
I don't think so. I don't think so. Actually, after the 11th of April 2019, the regime of Omar al-Bashir now already gone. And this trial of the agreement between the military and the actually the change and freedom forces failed because there is no consistency between the formation of these forces. And after the formation of the second government by Prime Minister Hamdok, also only 4 parties from these forces tried to monopolize the government, and this was the failure. And also Hamdok himself, he said that when he has been appointed as a prime minister, he said that he didn't find any program of the political parties so as to implement. And this is one of the actually factors that caused the failure of the governments, the first government formed by Hamdok, and also the second government formed by Hamdok. And also Hamdok, he failed to bring all the political parties formed that forces of freedom and change together so as to find out a unified program. And due to all these conflicts, the Hamdok resigned. And now the only way for the military to follow the track of Suar al-Dahab during the rise in 1985, and not to make any agreement with any political parties, and all political parties should go and organize themselves so as to be ready for the election already declared to be in the year 2023.
Okay. Kholood, I want to get your thoughts on that. I mean, the view from Khartoum, at least from what we're hearing now, is that this really is just Hamdok's fault, and that this is not at all the return to a Bashir-style regime. But I don't know, what is it, growing pains? What do you make of it?
I mean, first of all, I think it's important to note that that is not the view from Khartoum. That is a view of, remnants of the former party who were loyal to Omar al-Bashir. I think the view from Khartoum is much more it's much clearer than that, to say that the violence on the streets of Khartoum, which by the way is a relatively new thing, is because of the enduring presence of the military and the way that it's been emboldened through the peace agreement of last year, bringing in rebels, former rebels, the weakest rebels, into the central politics. Emboldening it really to bring that violence alongside it into the streets of Khartoum. And so, I think the proof's in the pudding. We've seen recently that Burhan has given extra powers to the security services, which were a big part of Bashir's security state. We've seen appointments made in the security sector and in the legal or legislative sector, also by Islamists. Really, this feels like an Islamo-military consolidation, very much like the past few years have been a sort of a blip, have been an experiment where the military has tried to very surreptitiously maintain its power, and it has done that, evidenced by the coup. But in the meantime, people now know how to resist that kind of security apparatus. They know how to resist Islamo-military rule. They've done it before. They plan to do it again. Certainly, there are no signs that the streets will conform or will give up and let things be as they are and allow for this consolidation to continue.
Just for clarity, let me ask you, Kholood, because, Hamdok said that by resigning, he hopes to help Sudan pass through what's left of the transitional period to a civilian democratic country. I mean, is this just a difficult transition, or is it an absolute failure?
I mean, I think that the earlier transition, which ended on the day of the coup, October 25th, that's done. I think we're now entering a new phase of the revolution. Arguably, this revolution started off in 2018 or perhaps even earlier. And what we're seeing now is entering a post-Hamdok phase of the revolution. Hamdok understood, I think, that in a way he split opinions, though not objectives, of the civilian movement. People thought, let's give him a chance. Let's see if he can work with these military officers. Other people said, no, the framework doesn't allow him to do much. Now that he's gone, that conversation is moot. The conversation is now, how do we get the generals back into the barracks and out of the political and economic sphere of Sudan, which they have been in for decades, right, and which they've never used to bring about democratic change.
Well, I mean, in his speech, he laid out some of the requirements then to move the transition process forward that you're talking about. How do we get the military out of the barracks, back into the barracks? He said, quote, roundtable discussion is needed to draft a new charter and to craft a roadmap. Cameron, is that kind of technocrat speech? Because it sounds, excuse me, you can correct me if I'm wrong, very simplistic.
Well, I think one of the criticisms that we've heard repeatedly of Prime Minister Hamdok is that he ran the country like he ran a UN bureaucracy. And that's clearly not the way to run a fractious political environment like Sudan. So forming a committee if you don't agree, and then forming a subcommittee if the original committee can't agree, was a way to tire out perhaps your political interlocutors, but it wasn't a way to forge consensus, and certainly not a way to make decisions. And I think that's going to be part of Prime Minister Hamdok's legacy, was a kind of ineffective leadership style, certainly not up to the demands of the rough and tumble of Sudan's political life, and certainly not up to challenging the military on their continued overreach and effort to claw back powers that they had at one point earlier in the transition begun to cede.
Right. It's so frustrating because we see all over the world in these sorts of revolutions that the people are calling for actually technocrats in many cases that don't have these, connections to the political establishment and that aren't ingrained in the corrupt politics already. But we see that even the technocrat can't do this complicated of a job. It is so disappointing to see it develop that way once again. But let me go back to Khartoum, because I need to ask a question of Rabie Obeid about the military, because many are saying that the military is determined now to continue to hold on to power because they are very scared of having to face justice for an increasing number of crackdowns and deaths at the hands of their rule. How much is that at play here, with the military refusing to really look seriously at the democratic transition that they had promised?
Yes, I don't think that the military will continue, and the military already promised that they will leave power after the election, and in numbers of times they are saying so. And I think that the only way now is to form a government of technocrats, according to the the document, the constitutional document already signed when they toppled off the regime of al-Bashir. And there is no way again to return to the situation before 25 of October for the year 2021. And the only way is now to the protesters also they should give up so that this period, which is remaining period, to be a stable period for preparation of the election and for formation of the Constitutional Court and to complete the other constitutional organs. And there is no way, unless we all go in this track. Otherwise, our country will be subject for devastation. devastation and destruction.
Kholood, I'd like to get your thoughts on what you just heard from Khartoum again.
Well, I mean, I think I'm quite astounded, actually, about Mr. Rabie's complete lack of knowledge of Sudanese history, in that, military generals over the past 30 years have not brought about elections in order to bring about civilian-led democracy. They've brought about elections in order to maintain their rule. And he knows this very well, as his former boss used to do this very, very successfully. And so we're very much seeing that Burhan is playing by that same rule book, as we've said earlier. And so there's no reason to expect that any upcoming elections, which even with a 2023 timeline would be too soon for most of the political parties to get themselves ready for elections. But there's nothing to indicate that the generals are good faith actors when it comes to bringing about proper democratic transformation. So I don't really see the logic in expecting them to do that in 2023. If anything, we're probably likely to see something of an Egypt-style playbook of, quickie elections that really put in place a military leader who will take off his military fatigues, wear civilian clothing and present himself as the new president, all the while repressing all other forms of political action.
Okay. I'll tell you what, we're down to our last minutes. And prior to this program, we had reached out to our viewers on Twitter to ask what they thought about the discussion we were to have. We got a reply, a very interesting one from First World Citizen, who told us that Sudan is in need of development, not Western intervention in Sudan's political decisions. Cameron, let me ask you, Sudan is not Libya, but still, what proxy powers, if any, are at play here right now, potentially complicating the situation?
Well, I think the most significant proxy powers at play in Sudan are not coming from the West. They're coming from the middle powers in the near region. You're looking at the role of Gulf state actors, of Turkey and others, Egypt, obviously, neighboring Sudan. These are countries with a great deal at stake in Sudan, financially, economically, politically. And so they have been, I think, very keen from the very outset of the revolution to ensure a kind of soft landing for their own interests in Sudan. We've seen increasingly even the Russians becoming involved in Sudan, trying to undermine the democratic process there as part of their effort to undermine any kind of democratic transitions in Africa. So I do think that there are very powerful forces at play here. I don't think that the most powerful forces are coming from Washington or London or Brussels. And I think that is a marked shift from the politics of even, say, the Darfur era, where I think the West really did have an outsized influence on the politics of the country. You're not seeing that anymore. It's a new era for Sudanese politics.
Okay, Kholood, I'd like to get your final thoughts on what you've just heard.
I think the important thing to note right now is that Sudan is entering a new phase of the revolution. But what it needs desperately, more than just internal cohesion, which is very much there, is for the international community to figure out which side it's on. Currently, Hamdok's resignation has made it very simple to see. It is now very much a military dictatorship versus pro-democracy groups. And they need to choose which side they're on and support as much as possible the democratic principles they say they stand for.
So just tell us quickly, what specific action would you like to see taken and where that you believe could help your country? Go ahead.
Sure. I think there needs to be, first of all, more pressure on the generals to stop the violence. I think the country is currently in mourning. We've just had a very mournful New Year's and a very mournful National Independence Day. And people are unable to move past the sort of the anger and the sorrow. And in many ways, this is fueling, of course, the continued protests. But it's also, it's indicative of a very, very dark turn in Sudanese history right now. And so the people who are tacitly or overtly supporting the military, and that is both the West and the Gulf partners that Cameron mentioned, They need to now exert pressure on the military with consequences that enable them to see that this is not the path they should be pursuing. I personally think the military has been getting some very bad advice about how to play this, and that digging their heels in, frankly, is not going to give them the results that they want. If anything, it's going to make their impending fall a lot harsher. That's a message that needs to be communicated very quickly and very clearly to the military.
Okay, Kholood Khair, Cameron Hudson, and Rabie Abdul, Atti Obeid. I'd like to thank all three of you really so much for being with us on this edition of the Newsmakers. And thanks, of course, to our viewers for tuning in as well. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter at @the_Newsmakers. And be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.